The moment the truth is staged, love becomes a performance. Someone whispered just seconds before Ethan Carter realized his entire life had been arranged like a script he never agreed to read. And yet there he stood under the cold crystal lights of the Carter Grand Ballroom. Tailored tuxedo, $2,000 shoes, and a decision that would cost him everything if he got it wrong. 3 women stood in front of him like choices on display, each flawless in a different way, each selected not by chance but by his mother, Victoria Carter, the woman who built an empire from nothing and believed emotions were liabilities that needed management, not trust. Chloe Bennett stood closest, radiant, confident, the kind of woman who understood rooms before entering them, her smile sharp enough to cut through doubt. Madison Reed stood beside her, composed, observant, her silence louder than most conversations, eyes calculating every move like a chess player 5 steps ahead. And then there was Ava Brooks, slightly apart, understated, wearing a simple black dress that probably cost less than the champagne being poured that night, her gaze steady, almost detached, as if she was watching something unfold that she already understood. The orchestra played softly in the background, a controlled elegance that masked the tension tightening in Ethan's chest. Because this wasn't a celebration, it was a test. And everyone in that room knew it except the man being tested. Choose one, Victoria had said. Earlier that evening, her voice calm, absolute, as if she were finalizing a business deal rather than dictating her son's future. Or walk away from everything your father and I built. And just like that, love had been reduced to a transaction, a selection process, a controlled experiment dressed up as destiny. Ethan scanned the room, recognizing faces from Forbes lists, boardrooms, political fundraisers, people who didn't come for romance. They came for outcomes, for leverage, for entertainment disguised as high society. And somewhere between the soft clink of glasses and the quiet hum of whispered speculation, he felt it, the unmistakable sense that something was off, not just unusual, but orchestrated, too precise, too clean, like every reaction had been rehearsed before he even arrived. Chloe's hand brushed his sleeve, subtle, intentional. Madison's eyes flicked toward Victoria for a fraction of a second, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, and Ava, she didn't move. At all, didn't reach, didn't perform, just watched him with a calm that didn't belong in a room built on pressure. And that's when it hit him, not all of them were playing the same game. And maybe, just maybe, one of them wasn't playing at all. Ethan exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of expectation pressing against him from every direction. And for the first time that night, he stopped seeing 3 women in front of him and started seeing 3 stories, 3 intentions, 3 possible truths. Hidden behind perfect appearances, and somewhere in that realization, a quiet thought surfaced, sharp and dangerous. What if the real choice wasn't who to love, but who had been lying from the very beginning? The music did not stop, but something in the room shifted, subtle, almost invisible, like a current running beneath polished marble floors. And Ethan felt it in the way conversation slowed just enough to listen without appearing to listen, in the way glasses hovered mid-air before reaching lips, in the way his mother did not blink, not once, as if she had already calculated every possible outcome of this moment, and none of them surprised her. "Take your time," Victoria said, her tone measured, composed, but there was something underneath it, something sharper, like a clock ticking behind a locked door, and Ethan knew that was not patience. It was control. Chloe stepped closer first. Of course she did. Her voice warm, confident, perfectly balanced for an audience that pretended not to be watching. "Ethan, you know what makes sense," she said softly, her hand resting lightly on his arm, not gripping, just enough to signal connection. And for a second it almost worked, it almost felt real, until Ethan noticed her eyes flick past him, not toward the crowd, but toward his mother, just for half a second. Just long enough to confirm something unspoken. Madison did not move. She did not need to. Her power came from stillness, from observation, from letting others reveal themselves first. "This is not about feelings," she said calmly, her voice carrying just enough to reach beyond them. "It is about alignment, about future, about who can actually stand beside you when everything else is stripped away." And there it was, the language of strategy, not affection, a pitch disguised as sincerity. Ethan turned slightly, just enough to see Ava again. still standing apart, still untouched by the invisible choreography playing out around him. And for the first time, he noticed something different, not in her expression, but in what was missing. There was no urgency, no attempt to convince him, no performance at all, just quiet awareness, as if she was not waiting to be chosen because she never entered the competition in the first place. A server passed by with a silver tray, champagne flutes trembling slightly, and Ethan caught his own. Reflection in the glass, sharp suit, controlled posture. A man who looked exactly like the version of himself the world expected, and suddenly it felt foreign, like he was watching someone else stand there. "You are overthinking," Victoria said, stepping closer now, lowering her voice just enough to make it intimate while still commanding. "This is simple. Ethan, choose the one who understands your world." And that word, understands, landed heavier than it should have, because what she meant was obeys, adapts, fits the system she built. Ethan's gaze moved back to the three women, replaying every small detail, every glance, every word that felt slightly off. And then it clicked. Not a dramatic revelation, not a sudden shock, but a quiet certainty settling into place. This was never about finding love. It was about proving loyalty, not to a person, but to a structure, to a version of life designed long before he had a say in it. Across the room, someone lifted a phone, pretending to check a message but angling the camera just enough to capture everything. And Ethan realized this was bigger than a private decision. This was a performance being recorded, documented, evaluated. Chloe leaned in again. Madison's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. Victoria's posture straightened. And Ava finally moved, just one step forward, not toward him, but into the light. And in that single motion something changed, something undeniable, because for the first time that night, it felt like the script had slipped out of someone's hands, and no one, not even Victoria Carter, knew exactly what would happen next. "Careful," Ava said quietly, her voice cutting through the room without rising above it. "Because the moment you choose for the wrong reason, you will never know what was real." And it was not loud, not dramatic, but it landed heavier than anything anyone else had said that night. The room did not react immediately, but Ethan felt it. The shift, the subtle tightening of attention, as if every person present leaned in without moving. Because something about her words did not fit the script they had all come to witness. Victoria's expression did not change, but her eyes did, just slightly. A flicker of something that looked almost like recalculation, and for a woman who controlled everything, that was enough to notice. "Ava," Victoria said, her tone smooth, controlled, "this is not the time for philosophical statements." But Ava did not step back, did not apologize. She simply met Victoria's gaze with a calm that felt unshakable, and that alone broke the invisible hierarchy everyone else had been following. Chloe exhaled softly, a hint of impatience slipping through her polished composure. "Ethan, this is getting unnecessary," she said, her voice still pleasant but edged now. "You know what your life looks like. You know who fits into it." And again that word, fits, like people were pieces, like relationships were arrangements. And Ethan felt something inside him resist, not loudly, not dramatically, but firmly. Madison finally moved, just one step forward, her posture precise, her timing perfect. "This is not about pressure," she said, addressing him directly now. "It is about clarity. You have three options, and only one of them aligns with your future." And there it was again. Not who he cared about, not who he trusted, but who aligned, who matched the blueprint already drawn. Ethan's gaze moved between them, slower now, more deliberate, not searching for the right answer, but observing the patterns, the rehearsed confidence, the calculated pauses, the way every word seemed designed not to connect with him, but to influence the outcome. And then he looked back at Ava, who still had not tried to convince him of anything, who stood there as if the decision did not define her. And that was the difference. That was the fracture in the design. Somewhere behind him, a quiet click, a phone camera capturing the moment, and Ethan realized this was no longer just an internal decision. This was a narrative being built in real time, one that would be replayed, analyzed, judged. "What happens?" Ethan said slowly, his voice steady but carrying now, reaching further than he intended. "If I choose none of you." And for the first time, the room reacted, not loudly, but unmistakably, a ripple of surprise that moved through the crowd like a silent wave. Chloe's smile faltered for a fraction of a second before returning. Madison's eyes sharpened, calculating new angles, and Victoria finally stepped closer, no longer observing from a distance. "That is not an option," she said, still calm, still controlled. But there was something firmer underneath, something that sounded less like suggestion and more like boundary. Ethan held her gaze, feeling the weight of years behind that single moment. Expectations, decisions made for him, paths chosen before he could question them. And now this. A choice presented as freedom but structured as obligation. Ava shifted her weight slightly, not interrupting, not pushing, just present. And somehow that presence made everything else feel louder, more forced, more constructed. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air cool, measured, and in that breath he understood something that had been building all night. This was never about choosing the right woman. It was about choosing whether he would continue living a life designed by someone else. And as the silence stretched, as every eye in the room fixed on him, waiting, calculating, anticipating, Ethan Carter realized that whatever he said next would not just decide who stood beside him, it would decide who he actually was. "Then maybe the problem is not my answer," Ethan said slowly, his voice no longer searching but settling into something firm. "Maybe the problem is the question you are forcing me to answer." And the silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it, because this was no longer hesitation. This was resistance. Victoria did not respond immediately, which in itself was unusual. Her control had always been immediate, precise, but now there was a pause, brief, calculated, and in that pause, the entire room seemed to lean closer without moving. "You are making this more complicated than it needs to be," she finally said, her tone even, but the warmth had disappeared, replaced by something colder, more exact. "This is about your future, Ethan, about stability, about choosing someone who understands what it takes to stand beside you." And again, the same pattern, the same language, carefully constructed to sound like care while reinforcing control. Chloe stepped forward again, faster. This time, as if sensing the shift slipping away from her. "You have worked too hard to risk everything on uncertainty," she said, her voice softer now, almost persuasive. "Some things in life are meant to be strategic, not emotional." And for a moment, Ethan saw it clearly, not her as a person, but her role, her function in this entire setup, a voice guiding him back into alignment. Madison followed, but her approach was different, quieter, more deliberate. "You are not being trapped," she said, her eyes locking onto his, steady, unwavering. "You are being given an advantage most people never have, clarity before commitment." And it sounded logical, almost reasonable, but there was something underneath it, something that did not sit right, because clarity should not feel like pressure, and commitment should not feel like a transaction. Ethan exhaled slowly, letting their words settle without reacting, and for the first time that night, he stopped trying to interpret what they meant and started noticing how they made him feel, controlled, directed, observed, like every possible version of his response had already been anticipated except the one he was beginning to consider. Ava had not spoken again, but she had not left either, and that mattered more than anything else, because in a room full of people trying to influence him, she was the only one allowing him space, and that space felt more honest than all the carefully chosen words combined. "What if I do not want an advantage?" Ethan said quietly, not raising his voice, but somehow the words carried further. "What if I want to figure it out without being managed?" And this time the reaction was immediate, not loud, but visible, a tightening in Victoria's posture, a flicker of frustration passing through Chloe's expression before it disappeared, a subtle shift in Madison's stance as she recalculated again. "That is not how this world works," Victoria replied, stepping closer now, closing the distance not just physically but symbolically. "You do not get to ignore reality simply because you are uncomfortable with it." And there it was, the line drawn, not between right and wrong, but between control and independence. Ethan held her gaze, steady now, no longer searching for approval, and in that moment, something inside him settled into place. Not a decision about any of the women standing in front of him, but a decision about himself, about whether he would continue living inside expectations that were never his, or step into something uncertain but real. Across the room, another phone lifted, another quiet recording, the story building, the outcome waiting. And as Ethan looked back at the three women one more time, he realized the real test was not who he would choose, but whether he would choose at all, and the answer forming in his mind was already beginning to change everything. Then do not choose, Ava said quietly, and this time her voice did not just cut through the room, it anchored it, as if everything else suddenly had something real to measure against. And for a second, no one moved, no one spoke, because the simplicity of her words carried a kind of clarity that none of the carefully constructed arguments could compete with. Victoria's gaze snapped toward her, sharp now, no longer masking the shift beneath her composure. That is not your place to advise, she said, her tone controlled but unmistakably firmer. And yet Ava did not retreat, did not lower her eyes. She simply held her ground with a calm that felt almost out of place in a room built on influence. Chloe let out a small breath, the kind people release when patience begins to wear thin. This is getting out of hand, she said, her smile returning but tighter now, less natural. Ethan, you are letting this moment spiral when it should be simple. And there it was again, simple, as if complexity itself was a problem rather than a truth. Madison did not speak immediately, but her attention had shifted, not just toward Ethan anymore, but toward Ava, studying her now, reassessing, as if recognizing that something had entered the equation that had not been accounted for. Ethan stood still, feeling the weight of the moment settle differently now, not as pressure, but as clarity, because for the first time, someone had not told him what to do, what to choose, or what made sense. Someone had simply removed the structure entirely, and that absence felt more honest than everything else combined. Why would you say that? Ethan asked, his voice quieter now, not defensive, not uncertain, just genuinely asking. And Ava's answer came without hesitation, without performance. Because if it is real, it does not need to be forced in front of an audience, she said. And the words landed in a way that made the entire setting feel exposed, the lights too bright, the room too staged, the expectations too visible. A subtle murmur moved through the crowd, not loud enough to disrupt, but enough to confirm that others felt it too. The shift from spectacle to something closer to truth. Victoria stepped forward again, closing the space decisively, reclaiming control with presence alone. This is not a debate, she said, her voice steady, final. This is a decision. And the difference between those two words hung in the air, heavy, defining. Ethan looked at her, really looked. This time, not as the authority he had always known, but as the architect of the moment he was standing in, and for the first time, he saw it clearly, not just what she wanted, but how far she had gone to ensure it happened. Across the room, another camera angle shifted, someone whispering quietly, the story already forming beyond this moment, and Ethan realized something else. This was not just about him. This was about control being witnessed, challenged, and possibly undone. Chloe took another step. Madison adjusted her posture. Victoria waited, but Ava remained exactly where she was, steady, unaffected, as if the outcome did not define her, and that difference echoed louder than any argument. Ethan inhaled slowly, the air steady in his lungs, and as he exhaled, something settled, not a choice between three people, but a decision about the structure itself. And as his gaze moved once more across the room, across the faces waiting, calculating, expecting, he understood that whatever came next would not just break the pattern, it would expose it, and once exposed, it could never be unseen. Then say it out loud, Madison said suddenly, her voice cutting in with precise timing, calm but sharpened now, because silence will not protect you from the consequences of walking away. And that word, consequences, echoed differently than everything else that night, less like a warning and more like a promise. The room tightened again, attention snapping back into place, because now it was no longer just tension. It was escalation. Ethan turned slightly toward her, studying her expression, more carefully this time, and for the first time he saw something beneath the composure, not emotion, but urgency, controlled, calculated, but there, and that alone told him more than any words she had spoken. You are not asking me to choose, Ethan said slowly, his voice steady, clearer now than it had been all night. You are asking me to confirm something that has already been decided. And this time the silence that followed was different, not uncertain, but exposed. Chloe's posture shifted, just slightly, her confidence adjusting, recalibrating, while Victoria remained still, watching, measuring, as if deciding whether to intervene or let the moment unfold. Madison did not deny it, did not deflect. Instead, she held his gaze and said, "Every important decision is shaped before it is made. That is how power works." And there it was, not hidden, not softened, just stated plainly, and the honesty of it felt more unsettling than any manipulation. A quiet murmur rippled again through the guests, not loud enough to disrupt the elegance of the evening, but enough to confirm that what was happening was no longer just a private exchange. It was something else now, something closer to revelation. Ethan glanced briefly toward the edges of the room, noticing how many people were no longer pretending not to watch, how many phones were angled just enough to capture without being obvious. And suddenly it all felt larger, heavier, like a story already moving beyond the walls of the ballroom. So this was never about me, Ethan said, almost to himself, but the words carried, reaching further than he intended. It was about control, about making sure I follow a path that has already been mapped out. And for the first time, Victoria stepped in without hesitation, closing the distance. Fully now, her presence commanding the space again. It was about protecting what matters, she replied, her tone firm, no longer soft, no longer disguised. You do not build something of this scale by leaving decisions to chance. And there it was, the truth not hidden behind careful phrasing anymore, but stated as fact, as principle. Ethan held her gaze, absorbing it, understanding it, but no longer accepting it the way he always had. And that difference shifted something fundamental, something irreversible. Ava moved again, not stepping forward this time, but turning slightly, her attention no longer just on Ethan, but on the room itself, as if acknowledging the audience that had been silently shaping the moment all along. And when she spoke, her voice carried differently now, not just to him, but to everyone listening. Control only works when people agree to it, she said, simple, direct, undeniable. The words settled into the room like something solid, something that could not be easily dismissed or reframed. And for a brief moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing to counter, nothing to spin. Ethan felt it then, not pressure, not expectation, but clarity, sharp and undeniable. And as he looked back at his mother, at Chloe, at Madison, and finally at Ava, he understood that the decision in front of him was not about choosing between them. It was about choosing whether he would continue playing a role written for him or step into something unknown, something real. And as the weight of that realization settled, one thing became certain. Whatever he said next would not just change the outcome of the night. It would change who held the power when it was over. Then let us stop pretending this is about protection, Ethan said. And this time his voice did not just carry, it settled into the room with a weight that made people shift in place, not physically, but mentally, as if something they had accepted without question was now being questioned out loud. The silence that followed was not empty. It was charged, filled with the awareness that something irreversible was unfolding. Victoria's expression remained composed, but her eyes sharpened, not with surprise, but with focus, the kind that comes when control is no longer guaranteed but still within reach. Be careful, Ethan, she said quietly, her tone measured, almost gentle, but the warning beneath it unmistakable. There is a difference between independence and recklessness. And for a moment, the room seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see if he would step back into alignment or continue forward into something less predictable. Chloe crossed her arms lightly, her posture still, elegant but no longer as open, as if she was withdrawing from a narrative that was no longer working in her favor, while Madison remained still, her attention fixed entirely on Ethan now, not trying to guide him anymore, but studying him, recalculating the outcome in real time. Ava did not move at all, but her presence had changed, not louder, not more visible, but somehow more central, as if the space around her had expanded without her needing to claim it. Ethan glanced briefly at the crowd. Again, noticing how many people were no longer pretending this was just another elegant evening. How many were watching with intent. Now, because the story had shifted from spectacle to something closer to truth, and truth was always more dangerous. You built something incredible, Ethan said, looking back at his mother, his tone steady, not confrontational, but no longer compliant. But you also built a system where every choice has already been decided before anyone makes it. And this time, there was no immediate response, no quick correction, just a pause. And in that pause, something in the balance of the room tilted. Ever so slightly. Victoria took a slow breath, the kind that signaled control rather than emotion, and stepped forward again, not aggressively, but decisively, reclaiming space, reclaiming presence. And that system is the reason you are standing here with the opportunities you have, she replied, her voice firm, grounded. You do not get to benefit from it and then reject it when it asks something of you. And the logic was clean, undeniable on the surface, but something deeper no longer. Aligned with Ethan the way it once had. What it asks, Ethan said, his voice quieter now, but sharper, more precise, is not a choice, it is compliance. And the word landed differently than anything else he had said, because it named the structure directly, without softening, without disguise. A ripple moved through the crowd again, subtle but present, because even those who had lived inside similar systems recognized the truth when it was spoken that clearly. Madison's gaze shifted briefly. Toward Victoria, a silent exchange of understanding, of recalibration. While Chloe looked away for the first time, her confidence no longer anchored in certainty. Ava finally stepped slightly to the side, not toward Ethan, not away from him, but into a position where she was no longer framed as an option, but as something else entirely, something outside the structure they had all been operating within. Ethan followed that movement with his eyes, and in that moment, something connected, not as a conclusion, but as a realization, because for the first time that night, he was no longer deciding between people, he was deciding between realities, one controlled, predictable, already written, and the other uncertain, undefined, but undeniably his. The room waited, the air steady, the tension no longer rising but holding, like a moment stretched to its limit. And as Ethan looked back at his mother, then at the three women, and finally beyond them, at the crowd that had come to witness a decision, he understood that whatever he said next would not just answer a question, it would redefine the rules that question was built on. And once those rules changed, nothing about this night would remain the same. Then I will change the rules, Ethan said. And this time there was no hesitation, no searching, just a calm certainty that settled over the room like something final, something that could not be taken back once spoken. For a split second, no one reacted, as if the words needed time to register, not because they were unclear, but because of what they implied, not just a decision, but a refusal to accept the structure itself. Victoria's gaze locked onto him, sharper now, no longer measured for appearance, but focused with intent. You do not get to change rules you did not create, she replied, her voice steady, but the edge beneath it unmistakable. And for the first time that night, the distance between authority and challenge disappeared completely. Chloe shifted her weight, stepping back half a step, not retreating fully, but no longer anchoring herself to the moment, as if she recognized that the outcome she expected was no longer guaranteed, while Madison's eyes narrowed slightly, her attention no longer on persuasion, but on consequence, calculating what this shift would mean beyond the room, beyond the evening, beyond the narrative that had been planned. Ava remained where she was, but something in her posture changed, not in tension, but in presence, as if she had been waiting not for a choice, but for this exact moment, when the illusion would finally be named. You taught me that everything has a cost, Ethan continued, his voice even, not raised, but carrying with clarity that reached every corner of the ballroom. But you never told me that sometimes the cost is pretending something is real when it is not. And that sentence moved through the crowd like a quiet wave, subtle but undeniable, because it did not attack, it revealed. A few heads turned, a few expressions shifted, and suddenly the room did not feel as unified as it had before, as if the shared understanding that held it together had started to fracture. Victoria took a step closer, her presence commanding again, But this time there was no illusion of distance, no controlled separation. Just direct confrontation. "And what exactly do you think is not real?" she asked, her tone precise, almost clinical, as if she was dissecting the moment rather than reacting to it. Ethan met her gaze without flinching, without hesitation. "This," he said simply, gesturing slightly, not dramatically, but enough to include everything around them. The lights, the crowd, the expectations, the three women standing in roles they did not fully define themselves, all of it. And for the first time, the room did not just shift, it cracked, not loudly, not visibly, but in the way people stopped pretending they were not witnessing something significant. Chloe looked away completely now, her earlier confidence replaced with something quieter, less certain. Madison exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in recognition, as if acknowledging that the outcome had moved beyond prediction, and Ava finally allowed the smallest change in expression, not a smile, not satisfaction, but something closer to understanding, as if the moment had arrived exactly when it was supposed to. The cameras were no longer subtle now, more than one angle capturing, more than one person documenting, because this was no longer just a decision, it was a turning point, and everyone in the room knew it. Ethan stood still, grounded, no longer reacting to the space, but defining it, and as the silence stretched, as every expectation unraveled just enough to reveal what was underneath, one truth became impossible to ignore. The choice had already been made, not between the three women, but between control and authenticity, and the moment that choice was spoken out loud, nothing about the night could return to what it had been before. "Then let them hear it clearly," Ethan said, his voice steady, deliberate, no longer shaped by hesitation but by intent. And this time he did not lower his tone. He let it carry, let it reach beyond the circle around him, beyond his mother, beyond the three women, out into the room that had gathered to witness something polished and controlled, but was now watching something far more real. The music had faded almost completely, not formally stopped, but forgotten, overshadowed by the shift that no one could ignore anymore. Victoria did not interrupt, but her stillness had changed, no longer the calm of control, but the focus of someone assessing a situation that was slipping beyond expected outcomes. This was never about finding someone. Ethan continued, his gaze moving briefly across Chloe, Madison, and Ava, not dismissive, not critical, but clear. "It was about proving that I would follow a system without questioning it." And the words did not accuse, they revealed, and that difference made them harder to dismiss. Chloe looked down for the first time, her composure intact but quieter now, less certain of where she stood in the narrative, while Madison exhaled slowly, her expression unreadable but her silence more telling than any argument she could have made. Ava remained steady, but now the space around her felt different, no longer peripheral, no longer secondary, as if the center of the moment had shifted towards something she represented without needing to claim it. "And maybe that works," Ethan said, turning his attention back to Victoria. "Maybe it builds something powerful, something stable, something that looks perfect from the outside." And there was no sarcasm in his voice, no rejection of what had been built, only acknowledgement, which made what followed land even heavier. But it also builds something where no one is allowed to be real. And this time the room reacted, not loudly, but unmistakably, a subtle wave of movement, of exchanged glances, of silent recognition. Victoria stepped forward again, closer than before, her presence firm, undeniable. "Reality is not what you think it is," she said, her voice controlled but carrying a sharper edge now. "Reality is what survives, what endures, what continues when everything else falls away." And it sounded strong, it sounded certain, but for the first time, it did not sound absolute. Ethan held her gaze, and for a moment, there was no tension, no opposition, just two perspectives standing in the same space. One built on control, the other beginning to define itself outside of it. "Then maybe I am willing to risk something that does not last," Ethan replied quietly, and that sentence, softer than everything before it, carried the most weight, because it was not about winning, not about proving a point, but about choosing something uncertain over something guaranteed. A camera flash went off somewhere in the room, not staged, not planned, just a reaction to a moment that felt like it mattered. And suddenly the illusion of privacy was completely gone, replaced by the awareness that this would be seen, replayed, discussed. Chloe stepped back fully now. No longer part of the center, Madison lowered her gaze briefly, recalculating in silence, and Ava took one small step forward, not toward Ethan, not claiming anything, but simply aligning herself with the moment as it existed now. Unscripted, unstructured. Ethan noticed it, not as a signal, not as an answer, but as confirmation of something he had already understood, and as he turned slightly, facing not just his mother but the entire room, the entire structure that had shaped the night, one thing became undeniable. The decision he was about to state was not about choosing a person. It was about stepping out of a system, and once spoken, there would be no returning to what existed before. "I am not choosing any of them," Ethan said, and this time the words did not just land. They settled, final and immovable, like something that had been building all night finally finding its form. And for a moment, no one reacted, not because they did not hear him, but because they did not expect him to actually say it. The silence stretched, longer than before, heavier, as if the room itself needed time to adjust to a reality that had not been part of the plan. Victoria did not move, but something in her expression shifted, not outwardly, not enough for most to notice, but enough for Ethan, a subtle tightening, a recalibration, the look of someone who had just lost control of a variable she believed was fixed. "You are making a mistake," she said, her voice calm, controlled, but no longer carrying the same certainty it had at the beginning of the night, and that difference, small but undeniable, echoed louder than any raised tone could have. Chloe stepped back fully now, her role in the moment dissolving, her earlier confidence replaced with quiet detachment, as if she had already accepted that whatever outcome she expected was no longer possible. While Madison remained still, her eyes focused, not on Ethan anymore, but on the shift itself, analyzing what this would mean beyond the room, beyond the evening, beyond the narrative that had just been broken. Ava did not react immediately, but her presence felt different now, not because she had moved closer, but because the structure that once framed her as an option no longer existed. And without that structure, she was simply there, real, unfiltered, not chosen, not competing, just present. This was never about finding the right person. Ethan continued, his voice steady, not defensive, not apologetic, just clear. "It was about proving I would accept something that did not feel real just because it was expected." And this time the words did not just reveal the situation, they redefined it. A quiet murmur moved through the crowd, more noticeable now, less controlled, because the illusion of certainty had been broken, and once broken, it could not be restored to what it was before. Victoria took a slow step forward, closing the space one last time, her presence still commanding, still powerful, but no longer absolute. "And what exactly do you think happens next?" she asked, her tone precise, not challenging, but probing, as if testing whether he truly understood the implications of what he had just done. Ethan met her gaze without hesitation. "I figure it out," he said simply, and there was no arrogance in it, no defiance, just a quiet acceptance of uncertainty, and somehow that made it stronger than any carefully constructed plan. Across the room, cameras were no longer hidden, more than one person capturing openly now, because the moment had shifted from expectation to consequence, and consequence was always more compelling. Chloe turned away completely. Madison lowered her eyes briefly, recalculating in silence, and Ava finally allowed the smallest change in expression, not surprise, not satisfaction, but recognition, as if something had unfolded exactly the way it was meant to once the structure was removed. Ethan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling, not as pressure, but as clarity, and as he looked around the room one last time, at the faces that had come to witness a decision but had instead witnessed a refusal, one thing became certain: this was not the end of the story, it was the beginning of something none of them had prepared for, and whatever came next would not follow the rules that had just been broken. "Then understand this," Victoria said, and for the first time that night her voice carried something different, not louder, not harsher, but heavier, as if every word now held consequences that could no longer be softened or redirected. Walking away from structure does not give you freedom, it gives you exposure. And the word lingered in the air, precise, intentional, because it was not a threat, it was a definition. The room remained still, but the energy had shifted again, no longer centered on expectation, but on what would follow, on the reality that came after a decision that could not be undone. Ethan did not respond immediately, not because he did not have an answer, but because for the first time, he was not reacting to the moment. He was allowing it to unfold without needing to control it. And that alone marked a difference that everyone in the room could feel, even if they could not name it. Chloe had stepped far enough back now that she was no longer part of the immediate circle, her presence reduced to observation, her earlier role replaced by quiet distance, while Madison remained where she was. But her posture had changed, no longer angled toward persuasion, but toward evaluation, as if she was no longer participating in the outcome, but studying it. Ava stood exactly where she had been, but now there was no framing around her, no positioning that suggested she was an option, only a person standing in a moment that had become real. Exposure is not the same as weakness, Ethan said finally, his voice calm, grounded, no longer carrying the weight of proving anything. It just means you cannot hide behind something that was never yours to begin with. And the clarity of it settled into the room in a way that left no space for reinterpretation. Victoria's gaze held steady on him, and for a brief moment, something passed between them that was not about control or defiance, but recognition, as if she was seeing not the version of him she had shaped, but the one she had not anticipated. "You think this ends here," she said, her tone measured again, but quieter now, less about directing the room and more about addressing him directly. "But decisions like this do not just affect you. They ripple, they shift things you do not even see yet." And there was truth in it, not framed as leverage, but as reality, and that made it harder to dismiss. Ethan nodded slightly, not in agreement with her perspective, but in acknowledgement of the weight behind it. "I know," he said simply, and the absence of resistance in those two words made them stronger than any argument. Across the room, the murmurs had not stopped. But they had changed, no longer speculative, but reflective, as if the people watching were beginning to understand that what they had witnessed was not just a personal moment, but a break in something larger, something familiar. A glass was set down quietly on a nearby table, the sound small but distinct, grounding the space in reality again, reminding everyone that despite the scale of what had just happened, the world had not stopped. It had simply shifted. Madison glanced briefly toward Victoria, then back to Ethan, and for the first time, there was no calculation in her expression, only acknowledgement, as if recognizing that the outcome had moved beyond strategy. Chloe had turned completely away now, speaking quietly to someone at the edge of the room, her role fully dissolved. Ava remained still, but her eyes met Ethan's for a brief moment, not as a signal, not as a conclusion, but as something simpler, something unspoken, a shared understanding that did not need to be defined. Ethan took a slow breath, the air steady, real, and as he looked around the room one last time, at the structure that had shaped the night, at the expectations that had guided it, at the people who had come to witness it, he realized that the story they thought they were watching had already ended, and something else, something unscripted, had already begun. "Then we are done here," Victoria said, and the words did not echo with anger or disappointment, but with something far more controlled, a quiet finality that carried the weight of decades of decisions made without hesitation. And yet tonight, for the first time, there was a fraction of something else beneath it, something that could not quite be named, not weakness, not regret, but the unmistakable presence of something she had not fully predicted. The room did not disperse immediately, no one rushed to fill the silence, because what had just unfolded was not something that could be easily absorbed. It lingered, settling into the space between conversations, between glances, between the carefully maintained composure of people who were used to seeing outcomes, not disruptions. Ethan remained where he stood, not frozen, not uncertain, but grounded in a way that felt entirely new, as if the absence of expectation had given him something more stable than any structure ever had. Chloe had already turned her attention elsewhere, her presence fading into the background of a night that no longer needed her role. While Madison stepped slightly to the side, her posture relaxed now, not disengaged, but no longer anchored to a strategy that had lost its relevance. Ava did not move at first, her gaze steady, her presence unchanged. But now there was no tension surrounding her, no unspoken expectation, only a quiet alignment with the moment as it existed, real and unstructured. "You believe this is freedom," Victoria continued, her voice softer now, not for the room, but for Ethan alone, though others still listened, because they could not help it. "But freedom without direction is just uncertainty." And this time, her words did not land as control, but as perspective, something shaped by experience, by years of building something that required certainty to survive. Ethan considered it, not dismissing it, not rejecting it outright, but letting it exist alongside what he had already chosen. "Maybe," he said, his tone calm, measured, "but at least it is mine." And the simplicity of that response carried a kind of clarity that no argument could unravel. A quiet shift moved through the crowd again, not reaction, not judgment, but recognition, as if something fundamental had been spoken in a way that did not require explanation. A server passed by once more, offering champagne, but fewer hands reached for it now. The performance of the evening no longer holding the same weight it had at the beginning, because the script had been broken, and once broken, it could not be resumed in the same way. Madison glanced briefly toward Ethan, then toward Ava, and for a moment, there was no calculation in her expression, only a quiet acknowledgement that something genuine had replaced something constructed. Chloe remained distant, already disengaged, her role complete in a narrative that no longer needed her. Ava finally stepped forward, just one step, not toward Ethan in a way that claimed anything, but into the same space, the same reality, where nothing was defined by expectation anymore. And in that small movement, there was no declaration, no assumption, only presence. Ethan noticed it, not as an answer, not as a conclusion, but as something that felt real without needing to be proven. And that difference, subtle but undeniable, settled deeper than anything else that night. Victoria watched it all, her expression composed once more, but her silence now carried a different weight, not control, not direction, but observation, as if she too was recognizing that something had shifted beyond the reach of influence. The room slowly began to move again, conversations returning in fragments, people stepping away, the evening continuing in form but not in substance, because the moment that had defined it had already passed, and what remained was something quieter, something less controlled, something undeniably real. And as Ethan stood there, no longer part of a decision, no longer framed by expectation, he understood that whatever came next would not be guided by the rules that had once defined everything. And for the first time, that did not feel like a risk. It felt like the beginning of something that had never been allowed to exist before. The doors of the ballroom did not close behind Ethan. They remained open, just slightly, just enough to let the cool night air slip inside. And for the first time that evening, the space felt less like a stage and more like a place people could leave. He did not rush, did not make a dramatic exit. He simply stepped forward, one measured step at a time, each one quieter than the expectations he had just walked away from, and yet somehow louder than anything that had been said inside. The polished marble beneath his shoes reflected the fading light, the echoes of conversation soft behind him, but none of it pulled him back, not the voices, not the glances, not even the weight of what he had just chosen to leave behind. Ava followed a moment later, not immediately, not in pursuit, but in alignment, her pace steady, matching the rhythm of something that no longer needed to be rushed or proven. And when she reached the doorway, she paused for just a second, glancing back at the room that had tried to define everything before turning forward again without hesitation. Inside, Victoria remained where she stood, composed, still, her presence unchanged to anyone who did not know her. But those who watched closely could see it, not in her posture, not in her expression, but in the silence she chose to keep, a silence that carried more than any command ever had. Chloe had already disappeared into the crowd, her role complete, her presence no longer required, while Madison lingered at the edge of the room, her eyes following the open doorway for a fraction longer than expected before she turned away, as if acknowledging that some outcomes could not be redirected once they had begun. Outside, the air felt different, not because it had changed, but because nothing was controlling it. No expectations, no audience, no structure shaping what it should be, and Ethan noticed it immediately: the absence of pressure, the absence of direction, and for the first time, the absence of needing to perform. "So what happens now?" Ava asked, her voice calm, not demanding an answer, not filling silence, just placing the question where it belonged, in the space between what had ended and what had not yet begun. Ethan paused, not because he did not know, but because for once he did not need to know right away. "I do not know," he said honestly, and there was no hesitation in it, no uncertainty that felt like weakness, only the quiet acceptance of something that had not been decided for him. Ava nodded slightly, not in agreement, not in expectation, just in understanding, as if that answer made more sense than any plan ever could. Behind them, the lights of the ballroom remained bright, the structure intact, the system still functioning exactly as it had before, but something inside it had shifted, something that could not be undone simply by continuing the night as planned. Ethan looked back once, not at the people, not at the expectations, but at the space itself, the place where everything had been defined for him until it was not. And then he turned away fully, not as a rejection, not as defiance, but as a quiet decision that did not need to be repeated. The night stretched ahead, open, undefined, and for the first time, that did not feel like a risk. It felt like possibility. And as they stepped forward into something that had no script, no structure, no predetermined outcome, one truth remained. Some people inherit power, some people fight for it, but some walk away from it entirely just to discover what it was actually worth.